Welcome to another episode of Working the Word. And in this series, we have been exploring the Gospel of John. In this, our 20th in this series, we're going to conclude. We're down to chapters 20, 21, and they seem to just be tied together a little bit. We have resurrection and restoration.
In some ways, it almost feels like Peter's almost being resurrected as well.
It's almost like Peter is being lifted out of that drowning spot that he was in one of the other Gospels. John approaches the resurrection a little bit differently to the other Gospels.
To be fair, he's also approached most of the rest of it a little differently too.
But some things are common. For example, it's the first day of the week.
Yep.
And literally, it's the first from the Sabbath. The other Gospels actually say the Sabbath was passed, and on the first from the Sabbath, they just referenced everything. It was, first from the Sabbath, second, third, fourth from the Sabbath, up till preparation, and then Sabbath. So here we are, it is early. And John only lists Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb.
It could partially be like, later on we have a we reference, but it could partially just be that Mary is sort of his key, witness at this point. That she's the one who runs back to tell Peter and John.
And then runs back to the tomb.
That, it's not necessarily that weren't the other women present, because, we know from the other accounts they were.
We have the we there.
But just, it's John leaves out a lot of stuff that's not necessarily relevant to his point.
That sometimes all these things can distract the mind as to, who was there and why were they, and so on. Whatever, they are there, it's still dark. And the other Gospels have as it was dawning towards the first day of the week.
Well, that sort of period of early, there's grey area there.
There's enough, though, that when they get there, they can see that the stone has already been removed from the tomb.
Though, knowing what we know from the other Gospels, the stone already having been removed and it's still a bit dark, that's got to be a little bit terrifying as an experience if you're one of the guards on duty. You can't sort of, look around and just go, okay, well, I can see what's going on because it's still dark.
How much she actually sees, we don't know. All that we know is she sees that the stone has been removed from the tomb.
Well, from later on, it kind of looks like she didn't have a close look. She's just like, the stone's gone, run back. She then returns, but her first response is to run back and go back up, I guess.
And clearly that wasn't what she was expecting.
No.
She's not yet believing. She is experiencing something she hadn't expected.
To be fair, though, in that stage of grief, you're not really processing that kind of thing. You're dealing with the emotions that come with, somebody I adore just got brutally murdered 2 days ago. That comes with feelings.
And she doesn't just walk back to town. John describes her as running. And coming to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, he is going to out himself before we get to the end of this passage.
That being said, I kind of like that he's chosen to map his entire identity in this book around being the disciple Jesus loved.
It's almost for God so loved.
But that is the key thing that he grasps onto is his identity.
Jesus loves me, this I know. There we have it from John. But Mary gets there, she says to them, they, nebulous.
It's almost kind of a passive. Like, it's not necessarily that specifically somebody did it. It, like, he has been taken, kind of.
They did it. They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. As a consequence, Peter and the other disciple headed out for the tomb.
I kind of find the next verse a little bit funny. Like, the two disciples are running together, and we know who's writing this, but the other disciple ran faster. It's like this tiny little backhand shade at Peter, like, you know, they're both running, but John's just like, but I ran faster almost. But you've almost got this, like, you know, John gets there and stops, Peter gets there, runs in. Mm-hmm. So
there's that little bit of they're running together, but they're running competitively. One maybe is a little bit younger than Peter.
And John wanted to make sure you knew who got there first.
And having stooped down, he sees the linen cloths lying there. And the word that's translated sees is not the same one that's going to be used in the next verse for Peter. It's almost got the idea of having a man look.
Kind of looking, but not looking.
Yeah, you're really not taking in what you're seeing. So he sees that the linen cloth is lying there.
At the same time, you get this sense, like particularly from the verses that are coming, that his brain is already in motion. Mm-hmm. Like he hasn't gone in and he's not looking really deeply. But Peter kind of comes in, assesses the situation and sort of toodles off, whereas John comes in eventually, has a deeper look, and we get, you know, that he saw and believed. So you've kind of got the, like, yes, maybe he's not looking quite as deeply as Peter, but there's also the thinking, processing. I don't, like, you know, it says he didn't understand, but he believed. So I kind of feel like, you know, he's maybe sort of churned back into his, wait, okay, let me process, think this through.
But there's certainly something happening here, because when Peter goes in, he sees the linen cloths lying there. And the sudarian that was upon his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but having been folded up in a place by itself. There's that definite contrast built in. There's something just out of place here. If, as Mary has suggested, they've stolen it.
I mean, if you're stealing a dead body, you generally don't unwrap it first. Like, that's a little bit weird.
Theoretically, the cloths are worth a whole lot more than the body.
Yes. Particularly the body of, you know, convicted criminal, essentially.
But Peter takes it all in. He sees the incongruity. You know, the towel that's been over the face has actually just been folded up neatly and put in a place.
It's not just kind of rip this thing off. There's intention and almost a cleaning up.
And it's almost like he's in there and John says, well, yeah. And John goes in and he saw, and I get the sense that he now perceives what Peter is perceiving.
He really saw. But I also kind of find it interesting that we've sort of got this, you know, he saw and believed. Now, we're coming to, in a few verses now, John talking about, you know, the entire point of all of this being to believe. And we have John here seeing this scene that doesn't really make sense, because it says he saw and believed, for not yet did they understand the scripture. So he doesn't necessarily understand, but, like, you know, he believes even though he doesn't know what to...
And it's probably a fairly significant point, because looking at the Old Testament scriptures, what scriptures do we have that talk about him rising from the dead? And I can't think of any.
At least not, you know, the kind that would be really well known as far as, like, there might be some sort of oblique references, but unless look there and what they mean, then...
Yeah, we had ones like, they pierced my hands and my side. They divided my garments among them. They cast lots. Really specific prophecy for the crucifixion. But when we come to resurrection, there's none of that specific stuff. So they are not making up a story to fit with some prophecies. They are believing because of something that they are seeing.
And I almost wonder a little bit, given the detail that John gives us about, how things were folded and arranged and stuff, whether there was just something familiar about the way that it was done. Like, if you've been living with someone for like 3 years, day in, day out, you kind of start to get to see some of their mannerisms. And like, if somebody has come in and unwrapped and taken the body, they're probably not going to fold it in the way that is really familiar, from the person you love. And if John kind of looks and goes, that, just something about that looks familiar, that it's not that somebody else could have done this, that's him. Because John is very specific about, the arrangement that they see. So I'm kind of wondering whether there's a little bit of inside knowledge there.
And it could be a little bit more. It's interesting, when Mary comes back, she sees something different here. A number of commentators have observed it's the arrangement of the linen sheets and the face cloths that prompts John to believe. Rather than looking like a grave robbery, what John seems to describe as a scene that looks as if somebody just got out of bed.
So took the grave clothes off. I won't be needing these anymore.
Didn't make the bed. Yeah, took the face cloth and folded it neatly, but the rest just looks like got out of bed. And not so much like a scene that's been disturbed by grave robbers. You'd be in, get out. And the fact that they didn't understand it from a biblical prophecy point of view stands against this being a made-up and invented story.
I think the other thing that helps with that we don't get quite as much a sense of in John as we do in the other Gospels, is that, you've got this group of guys who've, we know specifically about the guys, who've been with him all this time, and after he's been killed, they're cowering in an upper room, terrified they're going to be next. And a couple of days later, they're suddenly, woohoo, this is great, everything's fantastic, that, news is good, we're that kind of transformation doesn't just kind of like, what, actually, we can spin this. Like, that's, if you're huddling up together in an upper room, terrified that the Romans are going to come and kill you next, or the Jewish leaders are going to come for you as soon as Passover is done and they don't have to deal with the ceremonial stuff. There's nothing that explains that transition other than
something really
something happened.
I think it was Colson, who was part of the Watergate scandal, said that this whole thing is beyond making up. He said that 12 men could hold on to a story under persecution for 30, 40, 50 years.
And not just them, like, the women, even the soldiers who, if anybody could hold on to the story, it'd be them. But we know that the soldiers were, came back and reported in at least one of the Gospels. But you've just got, he's appeared to too many people.
For it to be a made-up thing, a story that we're going to just stick to for spin purposes. To what purpose? To get yourself into trouble.
Yeah, it's you don't die for a made-up story.
And you normally don't tell lies in order to get yourself into trouble.
No.
To the opposite, you normally tell lies to get yourself out of trouble. So, Peter and John go home.
I kind of like, John, it seems like they've understood different things from this. Like Peter's just he's not there, okay, gone home. John's like, he's not there, believes, and goes home. Like, there's no sort of, maybe I should hang around and see what's going on. There's no, that the response is to just kind of go home and I guess I'll hear from him eventually or whatever it is. But, that their understanding of it is different, but they both just kind of, they head back home to process, I guess.
So we have the contrast. But Mary has already run through to Peter and John's house. I have a feeling that she wasn't quite as fast on the return trip.
Well, they were fresh and she was not. And I also don't think she's actually been into it yet because, as she was weeping, she stooped down into the tomb. I suspect that's actually the first time she's really gone in to have a look.
Mm-hmm. And she actually doesn't go in, she stoops down to look. And she sees what Peter and John didn't. When she gets there, there's two angels in white. One where the head would have been, one where the feet would have been, where the body of Jesus had lain.
I kind of find it interesting. This is one of the very few times in Scripture we encounter angels where the angels don't have to say, don't be afraid. That, she sees the angels and it's just like, that's perfectly normal. Now, often they appear just as men or human, I suppose.
And a number of the other Gospels just talk about men in white. But John introduces them as angels.
But yeah, it's one of the few times we get to see the angels without them having to go, it's okay. Whereas, like here, I guess they're saying it's okay, but it's a different kind of... And they're sort of gently letting her process it through herself, not just sort of, you shouldn't be crying.
They ask a question. Why do you weep? Now, we're going to come back to that question...
Shortly.
And allow her to process it, to talk about it. Okay? They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him. Same thing she said to Peter and John.
And there's a sense to which, she's going through the grieving process and having somebody, come and take the body really, really cruelly interrupts that. I mean...
It's an extra grief.
It's a massive additional grief. Now, yes, spoiler, it turns out okay. But, just in terms of how she's processing and living through this experience, like, she came there to do the last things and to get a little bit of completion, to get some closure, to do the things that needed to happen for him to have... an appropriate burial, and she comes here and it's not...
And in their culture, it was the role of women to prepare the body for burial.
And she can't do that if it's not there.
Well, Joseph and Nicodemus sort of took over on Friday. And
to be fair, though, we have the tomb because...
I'm not saying they did the wrong thing.
And
but they have come to complete the task.
And I kind of feel like emotionally the women might not quite have been in the right place to go through everything that day. Like, it's custom that you're supposed to do it. But, coming back to have to do it a couple of days later and having a little bit of space in the meantime might not have been a bad thing.
But to get there and find it missing... No wonder she was weeping. And I think the angels handled it very sensitively.
And, we can sometimes read into, particularly in terms of the way it's translated, woman, why do you weep? We can sometimes read a bit of a modern arrogance into that. That, why are you crying, you idiot, kind of thing. Whereas I don't think that sense is here at all. It's a we're letting you process this. Like, we're not telling you what you should be feeling, but, talk this through.
And Jesus with the disciples on the road to Emmaus.
Was the same.
Why are you downcast? What's the problem? And lets them talk about it rather than saying, you shouldn't feel like that. Having said this, she turned around. So, okay, she's been looking into the tomb, and now she turns around and she sees, well, we know she sees Jesus standing there.
And she knows now.
But
But at the time she didn't.
clearly she wasn't expecting to see Jesus there.
I mean, there's kind of a couple of different ways of approaching this, and, you know, we can't really prove any of them. Like, this isn't the first time that Jesus appears and isn't immediately recognized, even by people who love him. Like, you know, here you could make a case for, you know, if she's crying that much, everyone's going to be a little bit blurry. But there could also be a sense that there was just something different about him. That, you know, it wasn't sort of completely the same familiar, that there was something a little bit different, and so you didn't immediately make that association.
And very often we see what we're looking for, and she is not looking for Jesus.
And who is going to be in the garden this time of morning but somebody whose job it is to look after the garden? That makes logical sense.
And Jesus asked her the same question that the angels did.
But he tacks one more on.
Woman, why do you weep?
But he doesn't wait for her to answer that question.
Whom do you seek? Now, the last time Jesus said that was in a garden also. Back in Gethsemane, twice he said to the arresting mob, who do you seek? And having concluded that it's the gardener, she says, Sir, if you have carried him off, tell me where you've laid him and I'll take him away.
I find this a little bit funny. Like, okay, yes, she's in grief. She's not, you know, crisis brains don't think and process very well. But logistics here, the whole, you know, if you take it like a grown man's body, taking it away, let me know so I can go and I'll bring it back.
Or I will take care of it some other place.
Well, it says, I will take him away. Like, you know, I don't know whether she sort of expected the gardener to go, oh, yeah, he's like, you know, a couple 100 yards that way, and she'd just sort of go and drag him back or something. I don't think she was thinking this through very well. But just that idea of, like, I can fix this if you know, and if it is the gardener who's moved him, why would the gardener have moved him? Like, why do you just kind of, okay, so that body is in the tomb, let's just move it over there just to mess with people? But she's not processing here, and she's not really coming up with any rational explanations for why else it could be.
And Jesus is very gentle with this person in grief, as he was with Mary and Martha. No rebuking. He simply says her name.
There's something familiar in that she understands.
That people are being led to belief through different channels.
And, like, I think there's a lot of warmth and gentleness in his voice when he says her name. Like, you know, he says it with the kind of love that only, you know, she's only heard from him.
She recognises the tone of voice. This is him. And she is there. And she turns around again. And John just records she came out of term, she turned around. Now she turns around again and
Have a slightly better look this time.
she says to him in Hebrew, Rabboni.
Which, again, I think is interesting. It's something we touched on a little bit when we were looking at Mary and Martha. But for a woman to respond and go, teacher, like that is kind of significant in this cultural context.
And it's not just, you know, rabbi, it is my rabbi.
And I'm not sure that this necessarily captures it in terms of translating the words quite as much, because I don't think, you know, do not touch me Thomas shortly is going to be encouraged to touch. It's often translated a little bit more as "do not cling to me," which suggests exactly what Mary was doing at that point in time.
She'd stay in the garden with him forever.
And if she could possibly just sitting at like a 2-year-old or something, sort of, I don't want you to go, so I'm just going to sit here and hug your feet so you can't move anywhere. There's almost that sense of it, and Jesus is like, you can't make me stay here. It's not how it works.
There are other things that need to happen. I need to ascend to the Father. But there's something for you to do.
I also find it interesting here that, yes, we've got that, but we also have this, he finishes it with, what he wants her to say to them. That I am, in terms of he is, ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. There's that dual focus that's, again, it's been a thing that John's brought up, but this is a message that's going to get John's attention, if nothing else.
So he's been raised from the dead. Now he's being raised to the presence of the Father. And in the previous phrase, now go to my brothers. He has changed status, but he is not using it.
And it's not, go to those lowly lowlifes who betrayed me on Friday, I guess I can let them back in. It's, go to my brothers. The other thing that I find interesting is within this context, very often the testimony of a woman wouldn't be considered valid testimony, particularly this kind of woman. And the fact that, Jesus is essentially putting her at the front line of witnessing and telling this news, telling this story, is just kind of, again, if you were trying to make up something that people would believe, this is like, you wouldn't make it up this way.
You would get a reputable witness.
We've had Joseph of Arimathea, for example, and Nicodemus. Nicodemus coming by, that would be a good reliable witness.
Maybe the high priest coming by just to check on the...
Although reliability of the high priest could vary. But, that he's put this woman at the forefront of essentially telling the rest of the world.
And she does. She comes bringing the word to the disciples. And I've actually highlighted it in the same colour as believe. She believes. It doesn't say she does, but...
It's kind of obvious by how she's responding.
I have seen the Lord. And it's interesting, this expression Lord is not one that has been used over and over during the gospel.
But when we've got Thomas shortly, he uses it as well.
Use it again.
There's this understanding that the transition has taken place, and he's the real deal.
That Jesus is Lord, which in the Old Testament, Yahweh, is translated into the Greek Old Testament scriptures as the same word. She thinks she knows who she's seen. And as well, she said the things that he had said to her to say.
Which again are not the kind of things that Mary is probably going to have come up with on her own. But we've also had Peter and John both there. And
they know the tomb is empty.
But Jesus didn't appear to them.
Angels didn't appear to them. All they saw was some clothes, one neatly folded and the other like you just got out of bed.
But again, it's almost responding to them in a way that fits where they are at and what they need.
So here we are in Jerusalem. And that evening.
I kind of find it interesting here that Mary's coming like, I have seen him, he's alive. This is what he's had to say to you.
And this must be morning.
And yeah.
Yeah, the sun was just getting up really when Peter and them were there.
And we get to, it being evening of that day, the first of the week, and the doors where the disciples having been shut through fear of the Jews. It's like...
There is still a degree of anxiety.
And again, yes, she's been with him this whole time, but if her testimony, if a woman's testimony is questionable, do they actually, he's about to come and make an appearance and kind of verify her story, but it's been evening. They've had this news all day,
but they are still frightened. And Jesus comes and stands in their midst.
To be fair, it makes it sound like he didn't just sort of wander up to the door and knock and come in. If he comes and stands in their midst,
and then has to draw his attention to himself by saying, "Peace to you," which is a phrase that he used in his last talk with them before Gethsemane. Peace I give to you, my peace leave I with you, not as the world giveth. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither be afraid. They are still afraid.
And, if they'd actually really absorbed the message, I think, Mary clearly has, but there's an exuberance that comes with it. And, even if the Jews are still out to get us, they got him and they couldn't keep him got. And there's a confidence that comes with that they clearly have not yet caught up until this point.
But they will when we get into the book of Acts. They put Peter in jail and they couldn't even keep him in jail. They put Jesus in a tomb, they couldn't keep him in a tomb. And Jesus gets there and says, "Peace to you." And having said this, he ID'd himself. He showed them his hands and his side. And then the disciples rejoiced. And I've highlighted rejoiced, the same colour as believed.
The other thing here is that, Mary comes to them in the morning and says, "I have seen the Lord." They get to the evening, the disciples rejoiced, having seen the Lord. There's almost a sense for themselves as well.
But not everyone was there.
And I kind of like that he made special, took special effort to include.
But he actually repeats himself, even after they believed. He said to them again, "Peace to you. As the Father has sent me forth, I also send you." And having said this, he breathed on them and he says to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit."
Which is a little bit interesting because we know that they're going to sort of, receive properly at Pentecost in a little while to come. But there is a measure of the Holy Spirit given at this point because they need some now.
Suggests the Holy Spirit's an ongoing. And Jesus had talked about this moment again on 2 days ago, 3 days ago.
To be fair, in the amount of time that John, there's elapsed in terms of how many words in between now and then and the events, one could be forgiven for, that being a little less on the recent.
But then he has a little bit of an interesting, conversation about forgiving sins. If you might forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven them. If you might retain them, they're retained.
And it kind of seems like an odd thing in terms of, giving them almost authority to forgive.
And maybe we're going to see this played out in the next chapter when Peter has to know that he has been forgiven.
And there's almost a bit of, that everybody, there's probably not one of the disciples who feels sort of quite proud and pleased with himself how he responded to this. But I think there's almost an unspoken responsibility that, it's not, if you're stubborn and refuse to forgive somebody, then, they will still be held accountable. I don't think that's Jesus' point here. I think the point is more that, in terms of you need to be accountable for being willing to process and forgive, and that, you being unwilling to forgive has consequences.
And we have no knowledge of the next week. What happened? Well, we know that they're still in Jerusalem.
I'm also curious as to where Thomas was, where everybody else seems to have been gathered in the one spot. He seems to be elsewhere, whether he went home or...
And we're not told. We're left curious. But the other disciples are quite vocal, saying to him, "We've seen the Lord."
And to be fair, if you've spent all this time with them and you're in the middle of grief and sort of, that doesn't make sense, are they trying to kind of mess with your head or something? It's a whole bunch of guys, you've been with each other a lot, and everybody else seems to have their story together that, we've seen this guy who just died. And, there's often a lot of looking down on Thomas because he was a bit skeptical, but it's not unreasonable.
And it's okay to have questions.
And Jesus is very gentle with his doubt. And I think...
And he has been very clear about his doubt.
Yes.
Unless I see in his hands the marks of the nails and put my finger into the mark of the nails and put my hands into his side, I will never believe.
I mean, I think that look but don't touch could be just adequate for some of this. I don't know about putting fingers into the side. But, Jesus honours that.
Believing is not something that means just being gullible.
And I think it's one of the things that we tend to lose a little bit in terms of doubt being seen as a bad thing. That, if you doubt, that's, a mark of a lack of faith. And whereas God can take it.
And God doesn't ask us to believe without providing sufficient evidence on which to base our faith.
And the other thing that I think happens with doubt is the minute you doubt, you're actually personally engaging and you're giving God something to work with. If you're coming to him and being honest about your doubts, that gives him something to work with rather than sort of trying to pretend that you don't have any. And I think that's one of the things that really kind of comes through here, that Thomas is willing to have doubts, even when everybody else believes. He's not just going along with it because they say so.
And that's an admirable characteristic. Just because I say something doesn't make it so.
And it means that there's a chance for Jesus to give, to have a really personal encounter where Thomas himself has that encounter. It's not secondhand. That he gets to himself experience it.
And here we are after 8 days. Now, their way of reckoning was inclusive. So you count today, tomorrow, count 8 days. This is the next Sunday. The disciples are again inside. This time Thomas is with them. The doors have been shut.
And Jesus comes and stands in their midst. Like, shut doors don't seem to bother him at this point.
And says the same thing, peace to you. And then he turns and he addresses Thomas. It's almost like he's been listening. Bring your finger here and see my hands. Bring your hand, put it in my side. And be not unbelieving, but believing.
And we've kind of, Jesus is almost leading into the point that John is trying to make in the entire gospel here. That, you know, I'm here and I'm doing this so that you might believe.
And interesting, both the unbelieving and the believing are participles. They are like a present continuous. It's not a, well, you know, I believe, but I believe.
And going from the you know, I will not believe because I can't process this and I don't have the information, you know, to believing both as the constant, that it's sort of, it's kind of, it's a transition, but it's the same, kind of a flip of the same thing.
And Thomas is quick to answer and says to him, my Lord and my God.
Which realistically, I mean, we don't know what they said, but that was Thomas's reaction. That's actually almost a greater statement of faith than we've seen from any of the other ones.
So he was very strong in his unbelief.
And he's equally strong in his belief.
He is willing to change his belief and to be strong in his new belief. That Jesus has asked him to change his belief.
And I think it's one of the reasons why I think we maybe need to give doubting Thomas a little bit more slack, because, you know, when you really get into, there's a lot more complexity to the story. That doubt is okay, and it, you know, it actually sets a foundation for a much stronger faith.
But he is also bringing us to where we started this gospel. You know, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And Thomas has come to the point now where he can look at Jesus and say,
He's
my
buying
God.
into that, yeah. I also find it interesting that Jesus kind of gives, like, again, I feel like it's very gentle, like, you know, you've seen me because you've believed, or you believe because you've seen me. But blessed are those who can believe even without having to see me. And, like, pretty much that covers almost everybody from, like, that room onwards. That, you know, there would have been some in that generation who would have seen for themselves, but pretty much everybody else has to take it on their word.
To take the evidence of what they have experienced, and Jesus is going to give them sufficient. And there is a blessing in saying, I believe. I believe he was the Son of God. He died. He was buried. He came back to life.
I think there's also blessing in, like, it would be very easy to sort of have an in-group and an out-group. Like, these are the ones who saw it. They're extra blessed. The rest of us are kind of a bit less blessed because we didn't see it for ourselves. Whereas Jesus sets up immediately a foundation where that's not the case. Like, those who believe without having seen, those are blessed.
And John sort of wraps it up at that point. Like, it almost looks like the gospel ends right here. You know? So Jesus also did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name.
Well, it's essentially, that's where it's all been wrapping up to, and that's how it progresses. Like, yes, I think the story that we get afterwards, that John is the only one who gives us, is actually a really important one. I'm glad he does. And, you know, whether it was added then, whether it was added later, we can't really tell.
We don't have any without it, so
it has to have been added pretty early if it was added later.
But it's interesting, John just reflects that Jesus did many other signs that are not written here. In this gospel, John's talked a lot about signs. 17 times he talks about signs as we've gone through this gospel. Cana, the first of his signs. And then we had another sign. People saying, what sign do you give us? Well, they do more signs than this man. How can a man who's a sinner do signs like this? John did no signs, but everything this man said's come true. Even the chief priests and Pharisees, when they were trying him, says, this man performs many signs. And though he had done so many signs, they still didn't believe. John's reminding us here, Jesus did many signs.
And I think John is one of the few that actually gives us a little bit of that sense that, he did a lot more than I've written down here. Whereas the other disciples almost give you a bit more of we're giving you all the important things. John's like, I'm giving you all of the things that lead you to the point you need to get, but he did way more things than this.
And just when we're saying, that's the end of...
Wrapping it up nicely.
There's an
Not so much.
epilogue.
Yes.
What happened next? After these things, he starts chapter 21.
And again, we don't there's a lot of gaps in terms of what we know in this. Like, clearly Jesus isn't hanging out with him the same as before because he just sort of appears out of nowhere a few times.
Mm-hmm. And on this occasion, they've shifted location. They're back in Galilee. And they're at the Sea of Tiberias. And it happened like this. Simon Peter, Thomas, called Didymus, or the twin, Nathanael from Cana, the sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, and two others. Now, what were their names? I don't remember.
Not important.
7 of them were together. Simon Peter says, I'm going to fish.
It's so very Simon Peter.
I wonder what's going through Simon's head.
In some ways, I almost kind of think that this might be I need to get out of the house. Like, there's a processing that's still going on. Like, that's a lot to take in. Like, you've been with him all this time. You, particularly Simon, the events around his death were particularly traumatic. You watch that happen. He's come back to life. There's a lot to process there, and I kind of feel like maybe a day of fishing or a night of fishing, but it is kind of let's get out of the house and let's just do a human, normal thing. And
there must be still an anxiety about really his relationship with Jesus.
Well, that hasn't really been addressed. But everybody else is like, we're coming too.
So, they, I was going to say they backed up the ute and put the boat on. Anyway, they got into the boat, went fishing. Well, they went through the motions of fishing.
I kind of almost wonder whether the fishing might have been a cover for when everybody's out there in the middle and it's dark and you kind of doing the net. You can maybe have some conversations that are a little bit harder face-to-face in the daytime.
Mm-hmm. But we come to another sunrise. The sun has just come up. Jesus stands on the shore, but...
We seem to have a lot of occasions where Jesus can be present with them but not recognised.
Well, truthfully, they're 100 metres out, so, fair enough. But Jesus says to them, an interesting way of addressing them, children, do you have any food?
Which I think he already knows the answer to it. Again, it's, he's not sort of, as he responds to Mary, he's stepping her through the questions she needs to go through for in this experience. And it's not that he's, I'm hungry, dudes, did you catch anything? It's
Did you have a good night fishing? No. And he says to them words that have echoes from one of the other Gospels.
a little bit deja vu.
Cast the net to the right side of the boat. You'll find some.
I kind of find it interesting here that, they have literally done this before, that he has said, cast into the right side, and they cast, and fish came. And so this stranger going, cast into the right side of the boat, and like, oh, okay, cast on that side, and fish come, like, oh, I get it now. Like, it's not the stranger saying, do the opposite thing to the way you're supposed to do it. Mm-hmm. It's that they weren't able to haul it in because there was they had to drag it behind the boat to shore because they couldn't physically get it in.
And the disciple that Jesus loved says to Peter, it's the Lord.
Again, we've got John who's the first to pick up on it. Mm-hmm. Now, I also feel a little bit that John's kind of, marking for all to see that, so Simon Peter, having heard that it's the Lord, put on his outer garment, for he was naked. But John, really? This was an important detail because, and Simon Peter putting on his coat to go fishing, to go swimming is kind of a Simon thing, but it just seems like an odd thing for John to immortalise.
The Peter who had to be dragged out of the water now casts himself into the sea and leaves the others.
To bring the boat with all the fish in. Although, to be fair, when they come back, I'm pretty sure, he went out to help them actually draw it in, but...
Mm-hmm. And they were only 100 metres out, but... Why the hurry? But clearly he gets to shore first.
And that's probably actually not a bad thing, that he has a few minutes of almost one-on-one time before they get there.
But nothing is said. The others come in with the boat, they get to the land, they see that there's a fire of coals already there, a fish lying on it, and bread.
I actually find this interesting for two reasons. That, they've just bought a whole bunch of fish in, but Jesus already has breakfast cooking. He's not sort of, bring it in, lads, bring some fish over and we'll
cook up.
We'll make some breakfast. It's already prepared. He doesn't actually need them to bring any fish in.
But he does ask them to bring some fish.
But the other thing that I think is interesting here is that we've got, particularly from Peter's perspective, we've got this fire of coals. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be a sense of a trauma memory here in that, he was warming himself by the fire when this denial happened. Mm-hmm. And in terms of, Jesus addressing that trauma in this context, he's sort of unhooking that trigger just a little bit in that, that sense memory of the being by the fire isn't eternally tied to, denying.
But it's also interesting to me that Jesus doesn't say, well, before we meet, there's something you and I need to talk about.
It's been... it was 8 days between the first time that they saw him and Thomas. They're up in Galilee now, so there's been a bit of time elapsed. If Jesus had a beef and wanted to take it out one-on-one with him, there's been opportunity, there's been time.
And there is this whole unresolved thing in Peter's psyche. And Jesus' timing is important. If there's an important conversation to be had, let's eat, and then we can talk about it.
Generally a little bit better at having thoughtful and deep conversations when you're not starving, having just been out all night.
It's almost like the quotation that Jesus met people where they were. He ministered to their needs, and then he said to them, "Come and follow me." And their first needs are breakfast. And there's a good catch of fish there that's going to meet some ongoing needs as well. And Peter goes, pulls the net to the land. It's got 153 large fish.
Large fish.
And yet, miraculously, the net is intact. And so Jesus said, "Well, come, have breakfast."
I kind of find the next statement interesting, that, none of the disciples dared to ask him. To me, that almost feels like they wanted to, but no one was brave enough, which is kind of interesting. The sort of, nobody is brave enough to ask, "Who are you?" Because they know that it's him, but at the same time, they still kind of want that reassurance. It's kind of like in my head, I know that it's him, but I'm still a little bit uncertain about this. But yeah, that they didn't, not daring to ask him.
And so Jesus comes and he takes the bread and gives it to them. This has happened before too. And the fish likewise. Do we have an echo of the loaves and the fishes again?
Even almost in the, the meal they shared a couple of days ago, taking the bread and giving it to them. There is just sort of this reinforcement of that relationship.
And the last time there were loaves and fishes, the people wanted to make him king. But now they have recognised who he really is.
He already is king. You can't make somebody king who is king.
And John adds, now this is the third time Jesus was revealed to the disciples, have been raised from the dead.
Again, just, that we don't know where he was in between chatting with the disciples and showing up every now and then, but it's clear that things have changed and they're sort of having to go through and process it in their own lives.
And where do we go from here? What next? And even the going fishing could be a what next moment. What do we do now?
Or even just a restless, I'm feeling restless and I don't know what to, I don't yet know what comes next. And that's a way of dealing with that for just a little, like a coping mechanism.
But having had a feed, breakfast is over. Jesus says to Simon, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?"
I think that he's specific, okay, it's Jesus, of course it's specific, but some of the wording here is really specific in that, it's been a couple of nights ago that Jesus said that you're all going to betray me, and Peter's like, "I would never, these guys might, but I would not." And Jesus is kind of, giving him a moment here, do you love me more than these? It's sort of Simon's response is, "You know that I love you. Ideally, you know that I dearly love you." It's not, "You know that I dearly love you more than these." There's a humility that's come into this love somewhere in the meantime that Peter is willing to embrace at this point.
But in verse 15, the word love that Jesus uses there is a very deep word for love, agape.
And it's not the same.
A self-sacrificing love.
And it's not the same love that Peter references.
And Peter talks about the friend kind of love. And I've sort of flagged the different words just with a couple of Greek symbols there. It's the love of a dear friend. And Peter can't bring himself to use that same kind of love that God has. For God so loved the world that he gave.
The other thing, though, is this relationship is still a bit strained. There is still restoration that needs to happen in this relationship. And, after what he's just gone through, saying, yes, I have the self-sacrifice, it could feel really kind of hollow and empty, given that he's just literally not done that.
Not that long ago. And so he hasn't come up to the standard, but Jesus says to him, "Feed my lambs." And Jesus says to him a second time, same thing, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Agape love. And he says to him, yes, Lord, you know that I dearly love you, friendship love.
But it kind of feels like maybe that's the strongest thing he has to offer right now. Like, clearly it's not going to be too long, and I think that agape love is going to be showing loud and clear. But right now, that's sort of the most he can be strong for, almost.
And Jesus doesn't throw it away.
That's he'll take it.
He'll take it. You know, shepherd my sheep. I guess that's a little bit different to feeding, isn't it? It's protecting all sorts of things.
There's a responsibility that comes along with it.
Which says you haven't been discarded because of your failure. And he says to him the third time, Simon, son of John. And now he doesn't use the agape love word. He uses the dear friend, you know. Do you dearly love me?
From the way it's said, I kind of almost feel like that was a catalyst for Peter bursting into tears and maybe crying some things out that he needed to grieve. That, yes, Jesus is reinstating him, and, you know, particularly with there was 3 denials, there is 3 reinstatements, but it kind of feels like that maybe let the floodgates open. That there's a lot he'd been holding in and guilting and shaming himself over, that you know, the broken in that relationship that he was feeling responsible for, and just the grief that, you know, he's not processing. In Jesus taking this time to sort of, you know, one-on-one reinstate him, and both that, you know, Jesus had to ask a third time, but also that Jesus kept asking. I think, like, it's equally probably heartbroken and tears of joy, kind of, like, it's just, there's a lot of emotion and it needs to get out.
And Jesus, by his choice of words, has recognised where Peter can come to, and he has come down to Peter's level.
And I think, like, I suspect Peter's choice of words was very specific, and that Jesus' choice of words was also specific, and the fact that Jesus was sort of willing to come to his level. It's not, you know, I'm making you come up to my level, or it's not enough.
And Peter's response, Lord, you know all things. You know that I dearly love you. And Jesus says to him, feed my sheep. And really, in this conversation, we have Jesus' last instruction with the disciples.
And it's an empowerment, like, you know, regardless of the ways you failed in the past, you know, it doesn't disqualify you from being able to be in positions of leadership and use your, you know, tell your story, tell my story with credibility, and, you know, I trust you with it.
And there's the 3 things. There's the feed the lambs, there's shepherd the sheep, and there's feed the sheep. You know,
there's almost a progression here that, you know, you're feeding the young ones and looking
vulnerable
after them. And, you know, even when they're grown, there's still a degree of care that happens.
And I think that word care is the one that comes out of this. Peter is being assigned to be a carer of people.
And he's also got first-hand knowledge here of a lot of, like, you know, his own emotional journey, that he's maybe a little bit more equipped to respond to some people. Like, you know, for example, the Pharisees, who some of them we believe, you know, later came to faith. Who is going to be the best at nurturing these baby Christians with a past than Peter?
He's got a past. He is now an expert in being restored. And a person who's been restored needs to be a person who leads restoration to others.
As opposed to somebody who's never had to.
You know, Jesus had said, by this all will know that you're my disciples because of your love.
And part of what I think happens here is that Peter really, really experiences that love.
So that he can share that love.
And is therefore actually equipped to share it.
And then Jesus just gives him a little glimpse into, it's not going to be an easy road. The time was when you were young and you learnt to dress yourself and you learnt to walk and talk. When you're old, you're going to stretch out your hands. Another will dress you and bring you where you don't want to go. And he said this, John said, signifying by what death he will glorify God.
Which suggests Peter has probably died at the point of writing.
Yes.
I mean, it also kind of, to me, suggests that John has spent some time thinking about how Peter's death glorified God. Mm-hmm. Because for the most part, death itself doesn't typically glorify God.
But one who is faithful unto death?
But one who is faithful, sort of, you know, it suggests that the manner of death that Peter was going to have, like even though it was going to be unpleasant and not the kind that Peter would choose, would still be able to be a blessing if Peter was...
It would be a witness of his belief in Jesus and his life and resurrection. And Jesus' conversation with Peter finishes with these words. He says to him, follow me.
Which is kind of the...
way that it began.
Way that it began. Yeah, come and see. It's almost a reset on the relationship.
And Peter's, having had this affirmation, his mouth gets him carried away again.
To be fair, though, turning around and seeing that John is...
It almost looks like some of this conversation happens while Jesus and Peter are having a walk.
And John is...
And John is...
eavesdropping?
In close proximity. Well, John knows what happened. He's the one who tells us. And, you know, he starts to outline, look, he's the one who had reclined on Jesus' bosom at the supper. He's the one who had said, Lord, who is it that's betraying you? And having seen him, Peter said to Jesus, well, Lord, what about this man?
I kind of love the way that Jesus responds, though. Mm-hmm. Like, he doesn't actually answer the questions. You know, if I desire him to remain until I come, what is it to you? You follow me.
But we're not told anyone else's story. You know, other people's journey is not our business.
And I kind of find it interesting that there's so often that, you know, when we ask a question of God that isn't a question we need an answer to, he gives us the answer we need, not the answer we ask for.
Mm-hmm. And for Peter, the important thing is not what's going to happen to John. The important thing is, I want you to follow me.
But it started a rumour.
It did. And John, I think, tells us at the end, because he's getting to the end of his journey.
And he needs to kind of clear this up a little.
And he needs to put this rumour to bed. He's
not going to be like this eternal ghost zombie kind of thing that just lingers looking all old and haggard until...
But he puts it out on the table. This saying went out among the brothers that this disciple does not die.
But that's not actually what Jesus said.
Jesus hadn't said he does not die, but if I desire him to remain till I come...
What is it?
It's none of your business. It's interesting, if I desire him to remain until I come. Jesus again reaffirms, you know, I am coming back. If I want him to be still alive, then that's my business. If not, that's my business. What is it to you? And now John outs himself.
At the same time, though, in terms of outing himself, it's kind of like putting his stamp on it that, I saw this with my own eyes. It's a, this is an eyewitness. I'm telling you what I have seen with my own eyes, which you can't really do if he keeps it anonymous until the end.
Mm-hmm. So the disciple that Jesus loved, that was me, says John. And I'm the one who's written this down. It's almost like somebody has added, and we know that his testimony is true.
Or even the sense of, if it wasn't true, there's plenty of other people who can verify and validate it at this point. That it's, we're not just having to take John's word for it because John saw it.
And testimony is something that we've seen all the way through John's gospel. And so he comes back to where the last chapter ended. Yeah? There are many things. How did it go in the last verse? Jesus also did many other signs which are not written in this book. Epilogue 2, there are also many other things that Jesus did which, if everyone should be written, I suppose not even the world itself would have space for the books to be written.
I mean, it's a little bit hyperbole, but you get the sense of the vastness and the abundance of the experience of being with Jesus, I think. Jesus' ministry was only like 3.5 years. If you're talking from a technical point of view, there is a limit to how much you can do in 3.5 years that, the entire book world itself could not hold the full account of.
The people whose lives he touched.
But I think that sense of the vastness and the abundance and generosity within, in terms of how they experienced it, is more than words can say. And I think that's more the sense here than the...
His patience with those, his forgiveness of those who put him on the cross, the whole realisation, this is why he came. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. There are so many stories to be told. And John says, I want you, my reader, to be part of this story. I want you to read the story, listen to the evidence, because there's a blessing in those who, while they weren't there and haven't seen it, believe that Jesus is who he claims to be, and in believing find life in his name. And I think that's been our goal in doing this exploration through John's gospel.
And to be fair, that's been John's goal.
That's been John's goal.
In terms of if you're taking it for what it is, then you have to kind of try and find out what John was actually trying to say and stay true to that, rather than trying to make it say other things.
We hope that you've enjoyed this journey through John's gospel as we've explored and dug and followed Jesus up and down. And now it's over to you. Have we got to the bottom of it?
Nope.
There is so much more to find.
I think that's almost one of John's final points, that there's so much more to this. You can't just sort of do a skim and you've got it all.
Read it again. You will find so much more. And so we entrust this book to you, our viewer, not that you will listen to and follow us, but that you will believe in and follow Jesus. And we wish you God's blessing as you continue to do that.